Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you this evening to a wonderful program, and really a perfect program to end this year, 2021 on. This is our last lecture series of the year for the Legacy Foundation. The Legacy Foundation, of course, is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. We use this great history, this great collection, the spirit, the values of this institution, the Union League, for programs like tonight, scholarships, civics education, and to care for the wonderful collection of the Union League of Philadelphia. So this is a really appropriate way to end the year, because we started it, but really on a lot of the same themes that we're going to hear tonight, about the themes that are central to the history of this great institution: abolishing slavery, ending, of course, the Civil War in favor of the Union, and supporting the Constitution. In a year where we, of course, had lots of threats to the liberty that we've been trying to save for the last 100 and almost 60 years as the Union League. We got through it, and we learned a lot. We learned a lot about Frederick Douglass through the year. Now we're going to end with a wonderful program on a similar subject. So again, welcome. Thank you for all that have supported us throughout the calendar year. We only do this through the voluntary contributions from League members and others. So if you've supported us, I thank you. If you haven't yet supported us, I look forward to your support. Thank you. So tonight, our program will run about an hour long in length, about 40 minutes of lecture. We will have a Q&A section. We are on camera on Zoom and YouTube, so please use the microphones that are provided so that people can hear you. And please, as always, make sure that your question is 2-3 sentences. That's it. And you can put a question mark at the end of those 3 sentences. If you can't do that, you have failed. And Jim's going to be the one who's going to be the judge of that, right, Jim? And we have, Joe, you can always just turn off the sound if it goes more than 3 sentences. Okay. Please silence your cell phones, if you would. Take a moment to do that. And to introduce our program, the historian and just about everything else over the last 44 years at the Union League of Philadelphia, Mr. Jim Mundy. Jim.
Happy post-Thanksgiving, everybody. All right. So, Bill Kashatus is an historian, educator, and author, a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Earlham College, and I'll give $10 to anybody who knows where Earlham is. Indiana, all right. You got my $10. All right. Okay. I know, but you know what? That was a good quiz. I'm glad that people know where Earlham is. That's fantastic. Oh, you would know. Shoot, you're Quaker. I should have prefaced my remarks by saying no Quakers are allowed to answer this question. Okay, that'll teach me. They'll do that one again. All right. So Bill was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Earlham College. He earned his master's in history at Brown University and his PhD in history education at the University of Pennsylvania. Bill began his career as a middle school history teacher at Riverdale Country School in the Bronx, New York in 1984. He then relocated to the Philadelphia area the following year and began teaching high school students at Abington Friends School in Jenkintown and later at the Episcopal Academy in Merion. In 1993, Bill was hired as Director of Religious Studies and Community Service at the William Penn Charter School. So there was clearly a theme in his school teaching, which is kind of neat. After more than a decade of teaching and coaching, in 1998, Bill left independent education to become Director of Educational and Public Programs at the Chester County Historical Society in Westchester, Pennsylvania. He was also the curator, researcher, and principal fundraiser for 2 exhibits: Baseball's White Elephants, Connie Mack and the Philadelphia Athletics, and Just Over the Line, Chester County and the Underground Railroad. A prolific writer, Bill is the author of more than 24 books. He has written and published more than 200 essays in such periodicals as American History Magazine, Christian Science Monitor, New York Times, the Pennsylvania Heritage, Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, Philadelphia Inquirer, the Philadelphia Daily News, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and Quaker History, very appropriately. He has appeared on National Public Radio and Pennsylvania Cable Network, as well as on many local television and radio stations. And Bill lives with his wife, Jackie, and their 3 sons, Tim, Peter, and Ben. And one of his sons, Peter, is here tonight with us. I'm happy he's here. And they live in Chester County, Pennsylvania. So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. William Kashatus.
Good evening. It is so nice to be, I can't say really beyond COVID yet, but after teaching online for 2 years and all the Zoom sessions I have done with this book, it's nice to be in person. The only problem with that is I'm starting to lose my voice, so I hope that I can carry through on all this. Reminds me of the story of the clergyman who posted the Sunday sermon on the billboard outside of his church. And the title of that sermon was, "Did you ever wonder what hell is like?" And beneath it were the words, "Come hear our church choir." It is my sincerest hope that I do not sound like that church choir as this presentation unfolds. I would like to take you back to August 6th, 1850. Peter Friedman, an ex-slave who had recently purchased his freedom, arrived at the offices of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in Philadelphia. There he met William Still, a free Black abolitionist and director of Philadelphia's General Vigilance Committee. Friedman explained that he was searching for his mother, from whom he had been separated in slavery some 40 years earlier. As Still listened to the man's story, he was struck by the similarities to his own mother's circumstances. Charity Still was born, raised, and wed in slavery on Maryland's eastern shore. She and her husband, Levin, were the young parents of 4 small children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Levin purchased his own freedom, resettled in Burlington County, New Jersey, and became a farmer, hoping to save enough money to secure the manumission of his wife and their children who remained in bondage. Charity and her 2 daughters rejoined Levin after a successful escape, but were forced to leave behind her 2 sons, 8-year-old Levin and 6-year-old Peter. But that's where the similarities ended. According to Friedman, he and his older brother were kidnapped from their mother, who he referred to as Sydney. Carried south, Levin Jr. died a slave in Alabama. But Peter earned the $500 necessary to purchase his own freedom. With no knowledge of the last names of his mother and father or where he was born, Peter set out to find his mother. His search took him to Philadelphia, where he planned to pass notices in the African churches of the city with the hope that maybe some of the elderly congregants would know about his mother or her whereabouts. Listening to Peter's tale, William couldn't help but notice the facial resemblance between Friedman and his own mother. He wrote, "I could see in the face of my newfound brother the likeness of my mother. My feelings were unutterable." The reunion inspired William Still to assist fugitives who also longed to be reunited with their families. He and his wife, Letitia George, a dressmaker, often hid runaways in their home at 832 South Street. He also communicated with dozens of station masters and conductors. With their assistance, William Still coordinated the movements of hundreds of fugitives along the eastern line of the Underground Railroad from Northern Virginia to Canada. Although the activities were in direct violation of the federal fugitive law of 1850, Still assisted nearly 1,000 slaves to freedom between 1853 and 1861. In the process, He recorded detailed notes on every one of the fugitives that came under his care. In 1872, he published those records in a 780-page book titled Underground Railroad. It was his hope that the book would allow other African-American families to find lost members who had been separated in slavery. For all these efforts, William Still was given the endearing moniker Angel at Philadelphia. But Still's career did not end with the passage of the 13th Amendment. After the Civil War, Still became a pioneer for Black civil rights, using moral suasion to convince Philadelphia city officials and state legislators to desegregate the city's streetcars and reinstitute the Black franchise. But few Philadelphians know of him or his singular contributions because he was overshadowed by Octavius Catto, a younger and more prominent civil rights leader. While the two reformers fought for the same causes, history was kinder to Catto because he was a more dynamic figure who confronted directly the widespread discrimination in the city and became a martyr for Black voting rights. In fact, Still's efforts paved the way for Catto's success. William Still was born on October 7th, 1821. He was the youngest of Levin and Charity Still's 11 children. The couple, former slaves, settled in Indian Mills, Burlington County, 7 miles east of Medford in 1806. Levin hired himself out to local farmers until 1815, when he had saved enough money to purchase a 40-acre farm of his own. When his children grew older, Levin put them all to work on the farm where the family raised corn, rye, potatoes, and other vegetables. By adolescence, William was working several jobs in Burlington County and had the reputation of a very industrious worker. A busy work schedule prevented the Still children from acquiring much of a formal education, though they occasionally attended a one-room schoolhouse when their father allowed it. With such sporadic attendance, it's doubtful that William Still was able to read or to write, or at least with much competence. This has become a point of contention among his early biographers. As a child, William developed a keen interest in the anti-slavery cause, probably because of the guilt that his mother felt over leaving her 2 eldest sons in slavery. His curiosity became even greater when one rainy autumn night, he witnessed a fugitive being beaten by slave catchers. According to Still's first biographer, James Boyd, the incident fixed indelibly on William's youthful mind the atrocious character of slavery. The death of Levin Still on December 24th, 1842 also had a profound effect on William, leading him to question God's plan for his life. 2 years later, he relocated to Philadelphia and worked odd jobs, waiting tables, hauling wood, selling oysters, until he was hired as an errand runner for a wealthy widow, Elizabeth Elwin. In 1847, William Still was hired by the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society as a clerk and janitor for $3.75 a week. He also met and married Letitia George, a free Black dressmaker. Still proved to be a conscientious hard worker, and 2 years later was assigned the additional duty of gathering intelligence on the movement of runaways. He also purchased a home at 832 South Street and opened it as a station on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a pseudonym for the secret movement of Black slaves escaping bondage in the South to freedom in the North. They were assisted by a loosely organized network of abolitionists, both white and free Black. While the enterprise began sometime after 1780 with the Gradual Abolition Act in Pennsylvania, The Underground Railroad was most active between 1835 and 1865. The traffic along the illegal route increased significantly after the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which greatly strengthened a similar 1793 law. The 1850 measure not only gave slaveholders the right to organize a posse to assist in capturing a runaway, but courts, federal marshals, and bystanders were obligated to assist in the recapture or face stiff fines and even a jail sentence. Abolitionists adopted the vocabulary of the railroad to disguise their illegal activity. Accordingly, the term underground suggests a secret. The term transportation or railroad, a method of transportation. Those abolitionists who opened their homes to the fugitives were station masters, their homes, stations. Others who guided fugitives between stations were called conductors. Stockholders played a less dangerous and less conspicuous role, but a very important one. They provided the finances needed for bribes, transportation, food, and clothing. Vigilance committees, which existed in many northern cities, were the most structured vehicles of the Underground Railroad. In Philadelphia, Quakers established and supported the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, but working-class Blacks served as the backbone of the Vigilance Committee. Free Blacks sheltered and transported fugitives, as well as gathered and relayed crucial information to Still. Others kept watch for suspicious whites they observed in the hotels, boarding houses, or on the streets of Philadelphia. Many of the Vigilance Committee members belonged to Mother Bethel, the city's oldest and largest African Methodist Episcopal Church. Acting from a sense of personal obligation to their enslaved brethren, Philadelphia's free Black community raised the bulk of the Vigilance Committee's operating funds from Black benevolent associations. The Underground Railroad had two main routes: the Western Line, which began in Kentucky, extended through Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, and then into Michigan before entering Canada, where slavery was abolished in 1833. Cincinnati was the nerve center of this route, and Levi Coffin, a Quaker merchant, served as the principal coordinator. The Eastern Line originated in Virginia, extended through the border states of Maryland and Delaware into Pennsylvania, and then into New York or New England, and ended in Canada. Philadelphia was the nerve center of this route. The thick blue lines that you see on the map indicate the various routes fugitives took in their escape from the South. You might question the blue line that's heading into the Florida Panhandle. This was because the Seminole Indians, who had been enslaved by the Spanish, gave them sanctuary and protected them. And if you're a slave trying to escape from the Deep South, it's much easier to go to Florida than work your way up through all those other states. The thin orange lines that you see indicate the loose network of Underground Railroad routes. William Still served as a station master, a conductor, and a stockholder of the Eastern Line. As chairman of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery's General Vigilance Committee, he raised funds, corresponded with station masters and conductors, and coordinated the movements of fugitives along this line. He stocked a veritable storehouse of food and clothing for runaways at his office at 31 North 5th Street and aided in many daring escapes. Just as important, Still kept a meticulous record of the slaves he harbored. Between 1853 and 1861, Still personally interviewed the 995 runaway slaves who came under his care. Traveling the Eastern Line of the Underground Railroad, these fugitives came mostly from Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Still recorded their names as well as their age, their skin color, gender, and paid careful attention to family information such as number of siblings, names of parents, spouses, and children. He also recorded the details of their bondage, including the owner's name, how they were treated, and their reason for running away. Just as important to Still were the details of their escape, point of origin, date of departure, mode of travel, reward for capture, whether they were armed or if there was any physical violence along the route to freedom. Still compiled the information in a series of journals and kept them in his possession until 1859, when the papers of radical abolitionist John Brown were seized by federal authorities after his unsuccessful attempt to lead a slave insurrection at Harper's Ferry. Still, fearing that his own records might be captured by a pro-slavery mob, hid them in a Philadelphia cemetery and kept subsequent notes of his interviews on loose slips of paper. In 1872, he published the records in a 780-page book titled Underground Railroad. The work is considered by historians as the most authentic source on the secret route to freedom. Another 149 cases are contained in a separate Journal C, which was never published, but is housed in the collections of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. Until the late 20th century, historians ignored William Still. Instead, the white abolitionists who wrote early accounts of the Underground Railroad tended to emphasize their own heroics, omitting the contributions of the free Black community and the fugitives themselves. Often these accounts were further embellished and replicated in subsequent novels, plays, and in some cases, historical monographs. The result was an overemphasis on white abolitionist involvement, particularly among Quakers, and an oversimplification of a complex historical phenomenon that involved many religious groups as well as free Blacks and fugitives themselves. Not until the 1960s were the important roles of the fugitives themselves and the free Black community recognized. Beginning in the late 1970s and continuing through the 1990s, public interest in the Underground Railroad was renewed by Black historians who stressed the more aggressive role played by African Americans in their churches. Many of these interpretations were based on oral histories and local records that were previously ignored by scholars. Other historians, both Black and white, focused on interracial cooperation. Still others examined newspaper advertisements, court records, and the wills and inventories of slave owners in order to determine a profile of the type of slave who sought freedom, their motives for doing so, as well as their ultimate destination. Since the 1960s, historians have increasingly relied on William Still's book for their interpretation of the Underground Railroad, since, as I said, it is the most authentic work of its kind. But no one offered a careful statistical analysis of the 995 fugitives he assisted. That was my goal in writing this biography. Unlike previous studies on the Underground Railroad, which investigate random populations, my book examines a controlled population, specifically runaways who began their trek largely in one of the three states I mentioned earlier, Delaware, Maryland, or Virginia. It also contains a database of Still's 995 runaway slaves, categorized by some 20 different fields, including name, age, gender, skin color, date of escape, place of origin, mode of transportation, and literacy. Finally, some of my findings provide an important corrective to the historiography on the Underground Railroad. I would like to share some of those findings with you now. Let's begin with the examination of the age and gender of the runaways assisted by Still. I discovered that a great majority were young men in their late teens and 20s. 85% of the runaways were between the ages of 17 and 32, and the average age was 25. Young men ran away in greater numbers because they resented not only the physical abuse they suffered at the hands of an overseer or master, but also having to work for another man and surrender the fruit of their labor. In addition, young men ran away in greater numbers because they were either unmarried or had not yet begun a family. Without family responsibilities, they were able to strike out on their own and begin a new life in freedom. They also had the physical stamina to endure the challenges of a journey to the north and could better defend themselves against slave hunters than females. Now, this pattern reinforces the historiography, but I found that the eastern line of the Underground Railroad had a more significant number of female escapes than had been previously believed. The database reveals that of the 968 runaways whose gender is known, 24% were female, and 63 of those women demonstrated the courage and creativity to escape alone. Thus, while the number of independent female runaways was rare, it did happen. Second, in regard to the value of a runaway, I found that the Eastern line was consistent with the historiography in that the younger a fugitive, the higher he was valued. And you can see the various the data up there. The 35 cases where value of a slave was known, those worth between $1,600 and $2,000 each, had an average age of 25. And then the slaves get older and the rewards decrease from there. But according to the historiography, the reward of a fugitive commanded was based on 5% or less of his value. For example, a fugitive worth $1,600 in 1860 would bring a maximum reward of just $80 if he was captured. But I discovered that the reward offered for William Still's fugitives were much higher. Of the 73 runaways for which a reward was posted, 73% were valued at $100 to $500. If those estimates are calculated on the basis of the 5% rule, as the historiography maintains, those same runaways would be valued somewhere between $2,000 and $10,000 each. Those cash values are extremely high, even with the average age for the 53 runaways being just 23 years of age. And you really don't see rewards that high. Another important corrective to the historiography can be found in the comparison between individual and group escapes. While the majority of runaways were young single men who traveled alone so they could more easily avoid detection, a significant number of those individuals in my study escaped in groups. In fact, the majority of runaways in this study escaped in groups that consisted of one or more families. Of the 995 fugitives in the database, 66% escaped in 173 groups of two or more members, compared to 34% who escaped alone. This pattern is most likely due to the family composition of those groups and the belief that women and children would be successful only if they escaped in groups that were led by male runaways. This is significant because the historiography maintains that family escapes were extremely rare. And they were rare because families remained in bondage in order to hold the unit together. My findings show that if you want to hold the family unit together, you run away, particularly after 1850. In addition, because the majority of fugitives ran away in groups, they tended to come from the same geographical region. The majority came from the three states I mentioned earlier. The high incidence of fugitives from these three states was due to their proximity to Philadelphia and significant anti-slavery sentiment in the border states of Maryland and Delaware, as well as to the accessibility of water routes to the north in the case of Virginia. I also found, I'm sorry, I did cut to that one too quickly. I also found an important difference between the historiography and Still's runaways in the means of escape. The means of escape was largely due to the opportunities available to a slave. Since water passage to Philadelphia and other northern destinations was more readily available along the Underground Railroad's eastern line than it was on the western line, fugitives from slave states like Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware were more likely to escape on boats, schooners, or steamships rather than risk a more physically demanding journey over land. Predictably, one of the most common means of escape for fugitives on the Eastern Line was watercraft. Of the 343 cases for which the means of escape is known, 44% escaped via watercraft compared to those who escaped on foot, horse, and carriage or railroad. This finding offers, as I said, an important corrective to the historiography, which stresses that regardless of the Eastern or Western line, the majority of slaves escaped overland and minimizes water transportation. I believe that these differences are important and that the database will provide future historians with an important tool to do their own research. So what of William Still? What happened to him after he resigned from the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society in 1861? There were reasons for that. Not only had fugitive slave traffic nearly ceased, but the Anti-Slavery Society was experiencing financial difficulties and still wanted to earn more money than they could pay him. But the event that sealed his decision was being sued for libel by Ellen Wells, a fugitive slave. Wells had been allegedly raising money to purchase the freedom of enslaved family members, but still suspecting fraud, wrote a letter to another abolitionist implying that Wells was an imposter and a prostitute. Somehow Wells got her hands on the letter and sued him. When Still appeared in court, he admitted to writing the letter. He was fined $100 and sentenced to 10 days in jail. That was the last straw. With just $300 to his name and the only real wealth being $2,000 worth of real estate in the city of Philadelphia, Still rented the anti-slavery office at 832 South Street and sold coal to pay the rent. He also used the first floor to repair stoves and the second as a family dwelling. Within a year's time, Still hired competent sheet iron workers who churned out gas stoves, boilers, and heaters. He attracted both Black and white customers and had established himself as one of the city's most successful Black businessmen. In 1863, Still joined with fellow abolitionist Robert Purvis and the Institute of Colored Youth to recruit Black men for the U.S. colored troops. There he met Fanny Coppin and Octavius Catto, members of a younger generation of reformers who would later challenge him for prominence as civil rights leaders. The following year, Still accepted the post of camp sutler at Camp William Penn, a training camp for Black recruits, which is located present-day Cheltenham. Still preferred that position of regular enlistment and combat duty. The camp had become a target for swindlers bent on war profiteering, and Still scrutinized the purchases and records so well, he placed the camp on a firm financial footing. But as I said earlier, William Still's efforts did not end with the passage of the 13th Amendment. He continued to be involved in reform. He was a leader in many reforms. He was one of the organizers and financiers of the Social, Civil, and Statistical Association of the Colored People of Pennsylvania, which collected data on free Black men and women, as well as advocated universal suffrage. He was an active member of the Freedmen's Aid Commission. He founded an orphans asylum for children of Black soldiers. He served as president of the Berean Savings Association, the first Black-owned banking association in the city. And he organized the Sabbath school for the Presbyterian Church, as well as the first YMCA for Black youth. But his major contributions to civil rights were the desegregation of Philadelphia's streetcars and reinstituting Black suffrage. These were the same causes that inspired a younger generation of reformers led by Octavius Catto. Many were graduates of the Institute for Colored Youth, and belonged to the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League, including Jacob C. White, Carolyn LeCount, and Isaiah Wares. This younger generation had a different approach to reform, as well as a very different outlook on life. We're still relied on moral suasion in his reform activities and avoided the political process. The younger generation advocated direct action, drafted resolutions, and pressured municipal, state, and federal officials to legislate change. We're still worked together with white reformers, especially Quakers. The young activists discouraged involvement with white reformers unless they were politicians who could advance their cause. And we're still believe strongly in the Protestant work ethic, personal austerity, and unconditional commitment to a cause. The younger generation of reformers believed in having a good time and indulging in such recreational activities as theater, dancing, and playing baseball. Initially, their differences clashed over the common cause of integrating Philadelphia's streetcars. Philadelphia's mass transit system, which began in 1858, prohibited Blacks from riding inside the streetcars with white passengers. Instead, Blacks paid a fare to stand on the mud-splattered platforms at the front of the streetcar. Still saw the integration of the city streetcars as a critical part of a much larger struggle for human equality. Between 1858 and 1865, he worked assiduously at this effort. He used moral suasion as his weapon, writing editorials in the newspapers to appeal to white public opinion and enlisting his Social, Civil, and Statistical Association to circulate petitions among the city's white business leaders demanding the right of Blacks to ride the streetcars. When he finally presented the petitions to the presidents of the board of the railway company, they deferred to their white passengers, who voted to keep the whites-only policy. But it took Caddo and his young reformers just 4 years to achieve integration. Organizing the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League, the reformers actively lobbied the state legislature and worked on legislation to end the streetcar ban with Republican State Senator Marrow Lowry. They also applied direct action by organizing young Blacks to board the streetcars in open defiance of the ban. When police officers confronted them, they refused to engage in violence. Instead, they simply let their bodies go limp, making it more difficult for the police to remove them from the cars. Those of you familiar with the civil rights movement of the 1960s, I'm sure recognize that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was not only a great theologian, but a student of history. And that is why they adopted that tack. Finally, in 1867, Caddo and his band of reformers allied with radical Republican state legislatures, just as the U.S. Congress was poised to pass the 15th Amendment, guaranteeing Black men the right to vote. Realizing that their reelection depended on newly enfranchised Black constituents, these radical Republican state legislatures passed a new streetcar bill desegregating the cars. Still was jealous of the young reformers, not only for achieving the streetcar ban, but for establishing the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League, a new, more effective civil rights organization than his Social, Civil, and Statistical Association. Matters came to a head with the struggle to restore Black suffrage. Since 1860, Still and the SCSA had been lobbying the state legislature to restore the franchise Blacks lost in 1838 when a new state constitution was adopted. Caddo and Pearl joined the struggle in 1865, but neither group had much success, with the legislature defeating several post-Civil War referenda. That is until 1869, when the National Republican Party leadership decided to support a constitutional amendment to establish Black suffrage. Republican leaders sought to ensure their domination of both houses of Congress by protecting Black voters in the South and cultivating Black voters in the North, especially in Pennsylvania, where Democrats were beginning to challenge the corrupt Republican machine of Simon Cameron. Governor John Gary and other state Republican leaders pandered to Black voters and pushed for the passage of the 15th Amendment when it went to the states for ratification. They ratified it on March 11, 1869, and a year later, the 15th Amendment became law. Now, Blacks had a dilemma. Should they vote Republican due to their appreciation for the emancipation and the vote? Or should they use the vote to further the Black race, regardless of party? Caddo and Pearl were staunch Republicans and insisted on voting that way. But still, like Frederick Douglass and other earlier abolitionists, insisted that Blacks not become tools of the Republican Party and vote their conscience instead. The issue reached fever pitch in 1871 when Philadelphians went to the polls to vote for mayor. City politics were split along racial lines, with whites voting Democrat and Blacks Republican. City police, mostly Irishmen, refused to protect Black voters at the polls from white mobs. On October 10th, 1871, when Blacks went to the polls for the first time to vote in the mayoral election, one of the worst race riots in the city's history broke out. Caddo was shot to death by a white rioter. He was one of 3 Blacks killed that day. No one was ever found guilty. The U.S. Marines were called in to quell the riot. After Caddo's death, some young reformers like Isaiah Wares increased involvement in politics through an organization called the Citizens Republican Club. They built their base in the 7th Ward of South Philadelphia. Others like Jacob White Jr. drifted away from politics and devoted themselves to the cause of Black education. William Still broke completely with the Republican Party and voted for the Democratic candidate Alexander McClure in the subsequent 1874 mayoral race. But most of the city's Blacks remained Republican, blaming Caddo's death on the Democrat Party. Wares called Still a traitor. Many Blacks boycotted his coal and iron business and criticized him for not doing more to mentor Blacks who wanted to become businessmen. Predictably, Still soured on politics and turned his attention to his business, philanthropic interests, and to writing, publishing, and marketing his book on the Underground Railroad. Both the integration of Philadelphia streetcars and the fight to restore Black suffrage left William Still a very bitter man, and with good reason. Using moral suasion, Still worked assiduously to bring these injustices to the attention of state legislators, white businessmen, and the general public, and he kept those causes in play for nearly a decade before Caddo employed direct action to achieve the desired objective. Yet for the next century, Caddo was immortalized as a martyr to Black voting rights. Still, who died in 1902, faded into anonymity, and their different approaches to civil rights spawned a fundamental dialectic in African American history. It is a mixed legacy, and it is an enduring legacy that continues to define distinctly different strategies to achieve civil rights and embodies a constant but inevitable tension between passive resistance and active defiance, docility and aggression, self-reliance and direct action. The tension existed in the different approaches embraced by Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 20th century, and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X in the mid-20th century. Yet as history has proven, both strategies were necessary to achieve civil rights for African Americans. Thus, if we honor Octavius Caddo, which the city of Philadelphia has done with the statue on City Hall Square, Caddo, who died for the cause of Black suffrage, we must do the same for William Still, who jeopardized his life for his enslaved brethren who sought their freedom and later paved the way for Cato's success. Until the city of Philadelphia does that, it will never do justice to the struggle for civil rights that occurred here, or to William Still, who deserves just as much recognition as Cato for his singular effort in that struggle. Thank you. I will take questions. Yes. Yes.
Coming. I got it.
Maybe I missed something. You had mentioned he was not formally educated and probably couldn't read or write, but yet wrote the book and op-eds and whatever. Did he have a ghostwriter, or did he
No.
self-taught, or?
As I said, it was a point of contention among Still's earliest biographers that he didn't know how to read or write. He probably had some fundamental competence, but we do know that sometime between leaving Burlington County and when he was hired by the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, he could both read and write and do so fairly well. I don't know if Elizabeth Elwin, the wealthy widow who he worked for 2 or 3 years, taught him. But, you know, he did know how to write. And yes, he did know how to read. So yes, I mean, he could very well write a book. Sir.
Hold on one second. The microphone coming to you. Sorry. Sorry, I was going to ask a question. Did Octavius Cato, did he name himself like Malcolm X? Because just the, you know, Octavius became
His father,
Caesar.
the Reverend William Cato, gave him that name, Octavius. So he didn't name himself. I mean, his father named him. Rather an unusual name, but by 19th century standards, not really.
If you think about what he did, so Cato was the last of the Roman senators that basically died out, and then Octavius became, you know, Caesar Augustus. Just
right.
Unbelievable considering what he did.
Right. It's actually not pronounced Cato, it's pronounced Cato. That's the first thing. The second thing is that his father, the Reverend, was actually a historian himself and favored ancient history. So I'm sure that was part of the, you know, the draw to the name. Yes, Carrie.
Yes, in the 1882 edition of the Underground Railroad, Boyd's biography appears. And it's speculated that actually William Still paid him to write that biography so that he would have supplied that information, including the story of him learning to be erudite with the woman in Philadelphia during those 2-3 year span.
Mm-hmm.
On a separate thing, I'm questioning why Volume C, which I've had the opportunity to view in person at HSP, why was that not included in the general, in the Underground Railroad?
Let's start with the second part because that's an easier question to answer. Journal C was the last journal that he was working on when he had to hide his journals in a crypt in Mount Lebanon Cemetery. As I mentioned, that he was keeping records on loose scraps of paper after that. There were repetitive cases from Journal C in the other journals. So not every case in Journal C was ignored. The problem is I found 149 additional cases that weren't replicated. So my guess is that the confusion developed there. And he just may have very well said, I see these cases here, I put them in and thought he got the 149 that he didn't. So you're right. I mean, that astounded me. And I kept on asking people at the Historical Society, am I missing something here? Because I saw the discrepancy. The harder question is why he hired James Boyd to write that biography. And I think there are 4 reasons for it. First, as he stated, he wanted to write this book to reunite families separated in slavery. His family was separated in slavery. So he wanted to do this to reunite those families and publish it after the 13th Amendment. Secondly, he wanted to show that a Black man had the intellect to write and disprove the myth of intellectual inferiority among Blacks. I think the third reason is that he wanted the slaves to tell the runaways to tell their own story, because the people were telling their story were white historians or white abolitionists. And he wanted to let the runaways speak for themselves, to become active agents in their own history. The final reason, you could probably guess it, the Wells incident, what happened with Caddo, being called a traitor, being distanced by the Black community. He wanted to restore his integrity. For those of you who have not read the 1882 version or the 1886, which is the last one, because there were a total of 4 editions of that book that came out, it reads like William Still is the Black Benjamin Franklin. And I'm sure James Boyd meant to paint him that way. And yes, he was paid to do that. But it was the only way that having another party tell Still's story that he could create the necessary distance for himself. So thank you for the question. It's a very good one. Sir?
So the people who came through on the Underground Railroad, were they able to live as free people in Philadelphia openly, or were they still in hiding when they came through here?
Depends upon what time period you're talking about. We know that Pennsylvania passed, the state legislature passed a personal liberty law. It was in the 1830s. And that pitted state sovereignty against federal law, essentially. So yes, Philadelphia, being having the largest free Black population of any of the northern cities, which was approximately 20,000 free Black residents in a population about 250,000 in 1850, double that by 1890, it would have been fairly easy for runaways to assimilate into that population. So yes, Philadelphia attracted runaways like a magnet. What destroyed that was not only the Federal Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, because it became very clear there were 2 test cases that proved that that law was impractical. One happened out in Lancaster County in 1851, September 11th, to be exact, 1851, a date that shall live in infamy, when William Parker was trying to harbor some fugitive slaves from Farquhar County, Maryland, and his master came calling, and Parker killed him. He cut him up with a cycle scythe, and then he left. He left for Canada, and when he was asked why later, he said, "I have no country." And what he meant by that is, if the law is going to protect a slave catcher north of the Mason-Dixon line, this isn't his country. The second test case happened in 2 years later, 1853, in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, when federal marshals come to arrest a fugitive by the name of Bill Thomas. And Thomas escapes, but the Wilkes-Barre sheriff arrests the federal marshals for inciting a riot. And it resulted in a precedent-setting case called Maxwell versus Ryder. And this too pitted state law against federal law. And then with subsequent things that were happening, the Kansas, Nebraska, Bleeding Kansas, Taney's Supreme Court decision, Dred Scott, it became very clear that federal law was saying, you can take your slave anywhere. They're not free. They're always going to be a slave. Civil War was inevitable. Yes.
Thank you. Much of the work that he did in the Underground Railroad was during the time of the Civil War. And I am curious as to what his role was in the participation during the Civil War and how it did affect what he did. My second question, if I may, is that the Quakers were very proud of the work in the Underground Railroad. And what was his contact with them, and did they work together? Thank you.
First question about the Civil War. Civil War broke out in April of 1861. William Still left the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society that June. So his work on the Underground Railroad preceded the Civil War. And as I mentioned in the presentation, during the Civil War, he was active in recruiting Blacks for U.S. colored troops, and then he became the sutler of Camp William Penn, which is where those Black troops, or many of them, were trained. So that's the Civil War issue. The second question just popped out of my head. What was it? Oh, the Quakers, yes. William Still would be the first one to admit that he couldn't have done what he did without the Quakers. The Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, majority of Quakers. Passmore Williamson, who became famous in the Jane Johnson rescue, which is the one everybody talks about when they talk about William Still, actually went to jail because he was accused of assault and also failing to produce the escaped slave Jane Johnson. And Quakers have always been known for social justice activities. It's one of the things that drew me to the faith. Yet at the same time, I think it's always important to note, because the mythology seems to make every Quaker an abolitionist. And sometimes not only is every Quaker an abolitionist, they're an Underground Railroad agent. That's not true. The Society of Friends washed its hands of the slavery issue in 1776 when they made it a cause for disownment for any of their members to own slaves. Afterwards, it was individual Quakers that carried on the abolitionist struggle. Now, among those Quakers who were a minority, those Quakers differed on the approach to end slavery. Some of them were gradualists, meaning gradually end slaves. Some of them were immediatists. They wanted to end slavery. And the most radical ones got involved on the Underground Railroad, breaking federal law. Their argument was, whenever civil law clashes with God's law, we're always going to follow God's law. So not every Quaker was an abolitionist, and only the most radical Quaker abolitionists were Underground Railroad agents.
Bill, I think we've hit our 7:30 mark. So thank you very, very much. Appreciate it. I learned a lot, and that's always a good night for me. So thank you again.
Thank you.
And we can show our appreciation by doing what authors do. So if anybody hasn't yet purchased a copy, I'm sure Bill would be happy to sign it for you. They're in the back right-hand corner of Lincoln Hall. You can see Becca and Kira back there waving at us. So to show our thanks, go buy a book and read it. And it's a good thing to do.
I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have.
So thank you all for coming. This is I think our last program of the year. So I guess this is when we say Happy Hanukkah, because we're in Hanukkah right now, and Merry Christmas to everybody. And have a good holiday season and a safe one. And we'll see you next year. Thank you all.